Hello, my name is Tio Savage. In this presentation, I'll be hitting the high points of a new approach to the philosophy of mathematics I'm developing. In the accompanying paper, I get into more of the details, so I encourage folks to check that out if they wish. I'm organizing this talk into three major sections. The first focuses on consciousness, existential needs, and the importance of error. I then turn to operation and number. In the operations part, I will critique formal inferences, offering the concept of material inferences and algorithms as an alternative. And I'll also critique truth table conditionals, offering incompatibility entailment as an alternative. In the section on number, I will critique the meaninglessness of von Neumann ordinals, and instead propose that we think of numbers as first-person pronouns like I or we. One of the projects of critical philosophy that really came into focus with Hegel is the idea that the divide between being and knowing that funds dualist ontologies is the result of the experience of error, but the conclusion of separate substances, one for mind, one for body or matter, is itself an error. To recover from this error is to retrieve an original, if inarticulate, unity of body and mind, or mind and matter. And we make this inarticulate unity explicit through traversing the shapes of consciousness in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit. In doing so, one reveals that both consciousness and thingness are what Hegel calls the negative. What does this mean? Well, we begin with the idea that consciousness is not that of which it is consciousness of. That's a kind of a complex sentence, but here's an object. I'm conscious of the object. My consciousness is not this object. Consciousness is indeterminate, non-finite, not a thing. And so when we try to represent consciousness in the paradigm of thingness, like with a thought bubble that says I think, we notice how this I think in no manner represents I think. I think is sort of here, right? And this balloon is over here. So the I think escapes representational paradigms. Consequently, I think that we should use the null representation, what I call the null representation, which is to say the empty set, in order to represent the I think. Thingness, though, finite things, can be represented, and these representations are also negatively articulated. So we notice that this balloon is what it is by virtue of not being anything else. It isn't a brick, it isn't a pencil, it isn't my hand. And the non-essential properties that it has, like its redness, are also negatively articulated. So its redness is it's not being green, it's not being blue, that sort of thing. So both consciousness and what consciousness is consciousness of are negatively articulated. In the coming slides, I'm going to be talking about the infinite, by which I mean non-finite, not a thing. So that's how to interpret that particular word in this context. Critical theories are really quite diverse. There's critical race theory, critical disability studies, critical ethnography, and a whole host of others. Can we discern a common thread? Well, one common thread is an interest in existential needs. We're familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like the need for food and shelter and that sort of thing. And once those are secured, we begin to try to meet our needs as social beings. So existential needs are the needs for recognition and dignity and respect and self-actualization and those sorts of things. And because we are essentially social creatures, these social needs, our social being, how we are recognized, is a fundamental aspect of our being. Systems of thought that background those needs, or even purposefully exclude them, like formalist mathematics, risk uncritically reproducing oppressive social conditions. While critical theories and the conditions they seek to explain are really diverse, to the point where it seems almost problematic to assert a common ground, Ideas like goodness are apparently at work across cultures and subcultures and epochs. For all the trouble it causes, we seem to all have a basic existential need to be recognized as good people. Goodness here must be understood as a kind of a flexible category. In the United States, we just celebrated Independence Day, and in some subcultures in the US, nationalism is taken to be good. In other subcultures, that's not true at all. So goodness here needs to be understood flexibly, because each side, if there is such a thing as a side, understands and considers themselves to be pointing towards goodness. In addition to goodness, we all seem to bridle when we are taken as objects. In light of our existence as social beings, we are social objects, but the need for self-actualization demonstrates that we are objects on our way to becoming our own concepts. We are self-actualizing. As such, we are indeterminate. The journey is never complete. So those concepts and the objects or subjects that they codify are in some sense indeterminate, though we make them determinate through acts of self-expression. And so we may come to recognize this need to be recognized as infinite, non-finite, not a thing, is a fundamental and universal existential need. So I think that we need a mathematics that centralizes the experience of air. The category of perfect thoughts is perfectly empty, or depending on how Hegelian one wishes to be, vastly full. But we also need a system that's open, a system of rational norms that's closed, which is to say a system that bars the transcendence of its own enabling conditions, is necessarily incomplete. We know this through Gödel. And I think we also need to rehumanize mathematics. So in the paper I do that primarily through existential needs and embodiment. But it's also a pragmatist philosophy of mathematics. So it focuses on the doing of mathematics, which I think allows for the articulation of intentionality. Context is important in any knowledge claim. And so we can distinguish material inferences, which are basically context dependent, to formal inferences, like modus ponens, where the content of the terms is basically unimportant. In material inference, it's the goodness of the inference, its normative acceptability, or its status as a rational norm, that lends conceptual contents to the terms involved. In some contexts, the material inference may be good, in other contexts, not so much. So for an example, we may say that A is bigger than B, so B is smaller than A. This seems like a pretty good inference most of the time. But we could also imagine popping A at the moment of so, and that would falsify the inference. Or we could put a hairdryer on B and it would expand and then it would be bigger than A. So that's the kind of inference. Material inference is the kind of inference that I think we should build a critical mathematics on. So context sensitive. And the terms bigger and smaller here aren't formal. So it's not an analytic truth. Instead, the terms bigger and smaller gain content by virtue of the fact that we accept that inference. Revising mathematics also requires reimagining basic logical operators like the conditional. The understanding of the conditional that I inherited was the truth table version, which is not very critical because it asserts a kind of dominance of something that feels rather contrived. Instead, if we wish to express hierarchical thoughts, which I think we do in mathematics, so that we can say things like if x is a rational number, then x is a real number, that sort of thing, we can instead use Brandam's notion of incompatibility entailment. To do this, we take a good inference codified with a conditional, like if Pokey is a dog, then Pokey is a mammal, and we can say that everything that's incompatible with being a dog, like being a fish or being a reptile or being a rock, is also incompatible with being a dog. And being a dog has additional incompatibilities, like not being a cat, that sort of thing. So dogness is a more restrictive category than mammalness, and mammalness is more permissive than dogness. And I think this allows for the negative expression of hierarchical predicates, and this way of expressing the conditional also allows for the free movement of reason. We can explain why this is so without reference to sort of an arbitrary governing structure. In my efforts to translate Lakoff and Nunez's embodied mathematics into a critical register, I found myself stumbling on ideas like 5 can be expressed as either 4 plus 1 or 2 plus 3 or 3 plus 2 or 1 plus 4. What one might normally consider to be a law, like the equality of result, I instead interpret as a kind of doing. This algorithm that I present here generates a bunch of equalities that flesh out the field of possibilities for how to talk about 5, and then consciousness comes along and negates certain of those possibilities, drawing out a particular expression like 5 is equal to 4 plus 1. It may be a little childish to ask, but what is 2? I think we need to be able to answer that if we're going to teach it. And the non-childish answer that I sort of brought into my teaching was this idea of von Neumann ordinals. And I take von Neumann ordinals to be the sort of normative standard of correctness. The mathematical community basically accepts them as the right way to think about things. But they're just collections of emptiness. And so when we try to teach this idea of number, it's a little dissatisfying. So how can we recover some meaning? And so we can teach what they mean. Anaphora is basically the ability to use pronouns. So when we say Tony is a tiger, he is orange and white. The he is an anaphoric term that refers to the singular term Tony. We may note that pronouns are indeterminate and promiscuous in the sense that he can refer to many different he's. Numbers, like 2, can also be understood as promiscuous in a fashion. So 2 can accompany balloons or apples and bananas. That doesn't exactly tell us what 2 is. The consensus opinion seems to be that we get numbers from abstracting over object collections. So we count 1, 2, abstracting. Instead, I think numbers are first-person pronouns like I or we, except that these pronouns refer to recollectively structured thoughts. That is, I think we can think of 2 as I think, and in so thinking, I recollect a prior thought. To really flesh this idea out, we must make some substitutions explicit. In particular, I'm going to take quotation marks to signify the act of recollection and use set braces for the same signification. So when we express something like, I said to him, I said, hey, Joe, we are recollecting a recollection. The I think accompanies each determinate thought. And so the I think is within both the recollection and the thought that's recalled within that recollection. So in conclusion, in this presentation, I critiqued and offered alternatives to formal inferences, truth table conditionals, semantic emptiness of number, and closed axiomatic systems that would fund a notion of proof. So proof is noticeably absent from this philosophy of mathematics. The mathematics I present in the paper is an attempt to express what we're actually doing when we do mathematics. And so the result isn't exactly intended to be a system insulated from ethical critique, just because it can be, mathematics can be used instrumentally or it can be used towards infinite ends. But I think that this sort of making explicit of existential needs in particular, and the idea of number as anaphora, move mathematical philosophy in the right direction. Thank you so much for your time.